I'm here to introduce Dr. Amy Churchill today. I'm happy to have her here. She's both a friend and a colleague for a long time. So Amy is currently an assistant professor of ecosystem science at Binghamton University in New York. And she just started this fall, so she's going to talk all about that process of interviewing and finding this position. And she has a PhD from ecology and evolutionary biology from here at CU Boulder. So that's, I guess, how you know her.
Yeah, I went to grad school with her.
Awesome. And an MS in biology from the University of Alaska Fairbanks, and a BS, BA in biology and environmental sciences from Stonehill College in Massachusetts. And she's a plant ecologist, conducting research on consequences of global environmental change at the interface of plant community and ecosystem ecology, with an experience in a range of biomes and ecosystem types. And I first met her when she was a postdoc working at Hawkesbury Institute for the Environment in Australia. And she was working on the Pastures and Climate Exchange project there. So looking at how Australian pastures respond to drought and changing precipitation regimes. And she was an awesome mentor there. And then afterwards, she came back to the US and got a USDA NIFA postdoctoral fellowship and worked at Cedar Creek in Minnesota. And along that whole way, she's mentored a lot of people. She's really good at mentoring and outreach, including while she was here at CU, she worked with the Project Extremes, which is excellence in teaching and research for elementary and middle school engagement in science. So worked with a lot of students then. Another fun fact, she's a very good baker. So I know there's a lot of us in the crowd that also enjoy baking. And with that, I am happy to introduce Dr. Amy Churchill for her seminar entitled Dissecting the Interview. Thank you, Amy.
Thank you very much, Allison. I'm really excited to be talking with folks back in Boulder today. I'm sorry, I would have loved to have a chance to come out west for giving this talk in person, but unfortunately I actually teach here in New York later this afternoon, so we are stuck with the remote presentation of these topics. Today, we won't be talking about my research projects. I'm happy to talk further if people would like to in that space. Instead, we're focusing on some skill development, focusing on demystifying and dissecting the interview process. And as Allison just was talking about, I went through the interview and being hired as an academic professor in this last year, but I've been interviewing for years and have interviewed with universities, national, federal agencies, nonprofit organizations, working internationally, and all of these have very different steps and processes, which can be very confusing if you haven't had someone to talk to you about how that process works. So that's going to be a little bit of our goal today. This is also not just going to be me talking at you about the process. That would be very boring. So we will have a few places where I'll pause, have you work with someone who's seated next to you. If you're online, we'll try to set people into breakout rooms so that we can have some ongoing discussions, give you a chance to practice some of the things we're talking about. So that's the general goal. And as Allison said, I did my PhD there in Boulder. This is from Rocky Mountain National Park, one of the photos here where I had done my fieldwork in alpine plant ecology. And now, of course, today I'm working in New York on what we call the Southern Tier. So here I am. That's nice. So today we have a few objectives. We're going to review and practice components in preparation around remote interviews. Review, practice, and discuss the difference then with on-site interviews, and talk through some best practices in hiring. So folks in this room generally either have a PhD or are working toward a PhD, which often means, surprise, you are now also in charge of hiring other people in addition to hoping that you will someday be hired. And so there are some best practices that are important to think about through this process that I want to review briefly. And then, of course, there are the things that we want to change, but they are not changed yet, and consequently, you should know that they exist and the associated red flags throughout the interview process that are likely to come up. And many of these, I have personal anecdotes that I can tell you how I handled them. So the first thing is that you have submitted an application, and this can often happen. This is happening right now for those of you who might be submitting jobs in the academic interview process this year. Those are due, typically they start in August and there'll be applications due all the way through March. So it's a really long process for academic positions. Federal jobs are much less tied to a particular time of the year, but the time period between when you've submitted an application and when you hear whether you get an interview could be as short as a month, or it could be 6 months or longer. And a lot of that is just hurry up and wait before you can start thinking about those next steps. So we're assuming at this point that you've gotten an interview. What are the first things that you want to start thinking about? And the first thing I really want to reiterate multiple times throughout this talk is that at every step of the way, allow yourself the chance to celebrate. Of all the applicants, and in some searches, as I want to stress, there could be hundreds of people that you're competing with for these positions. You have been selected to have a first round interview. A first round interview at university searches, at academic searches, at federal agency interviews, and including also in some nonprofits, that will typically include somewhere between 10 and 15 people. So out of a possible 300, you've made it to the top 10. That's a pretty exciting feat and something you should be proud of. The next things to start really thinking about, though, are the logistics. The scheduling logistics almost come instantly when they tell you you've gotten an interview. The immediate next thing that they're going to start asking is to schedule when you're going to have that interview. Sometimes there's more flexibility than others, but how you handle that coordination can often really set you up well for how that interview will ultimately proceed. So who are you coordinating with? You want to make sure that you have a fully clear schedule before and after, as well as however long the interview has been set for. These first stage interviews can really vary in how long they are. I've had some that were 20 minutes with very scheduled questions back to back to back. I've also had an hour-long first round interview that was a lot more open-ended and sort of more conversational. So depending on who you're interviewing with, the first round can look quite different. But either way, you want to be prepared to have time before and after, as well as that full period fully blocked off without any interruptions, or you run the risk of looking really unprofessional. There are a few things to check in on as you're getting prepared for the first interview. First of all, you want to know, how long is it? Is it 20 minutes and you have to answer 10 questions? Or is it an hour and they're going to give you 3 questions and then there'll be time for lots of discussion? These are very different ways to prepare and strategies for how you'll face these kinds of interviews. So it's good to know ahead of time. As much as you can, find out who will be on the call. It's never pleasant to get on a call, and these are often remote. So you'll either be on Zoom or on a physical phone call. And you think you'll be talking with a person, and then all of a sudden there's a panel and there are 10 people staring at you on Zoom and you don't know who any of them are with respect to the position you're interviewing for. Try not to have this happen. So instead, find out who'll be on the call ahead of time. It's also always useful to ask whether you will be able to know the questions in advance. This is one of those best practices that for those who are making decisions on hiring, I always recommend you share the questions with your candidates equally so that everyone knows the questions ahead of time. This will give you an opportunity to prepare the kinds of questions that the answers of how you would respond to those questions. And it gives you the chance to sort of pace yourself. Okay, I have a 30-minute interview. They're asking me 5 questions. So I know I've got about 6 minutes per question, less maybe 5 minutes per question if I want to leave room for some discussion and questions of my own at the end. And that's part of strategizing. And finally, you want to put together the background on the position and the people to a greater extent than you did while you were preparing your application. And this is especially true when you know the people who will be on the call. Make sure you know something about who those people are so that when they're asking you questions, you can recognize, oh, that person, this person, that person is responsible for these different areas relative to the position you're applying for. As much as you can, you want to practice your responses to the questions. If you don't know what the questions are, we're going to review some possible hypothetical questions that are very likely to come up. You want to practice those ahead of time on the platform that you will be using for the interview. The next, perhaps most importantly, logistic thing that I want to talk through is about also how you physically get your space set up in preparation for this interview. Not something everybody always thinks about, but there are ways that you can help set yourself up to reduce stress and make the process a lot easier. So we're going to talk more about what the space might look like for these remote interviews. So your turn to prepare for a second. You're going to find a person next to you. And first you'll have a think. To describe the position you're interviewing for. Is this an assistant professor in ecosystem science? Is this an ecologist with the Forest Service? Is this a rangeland scientist with the USDA? Have a think about the position, what its title is, and some context associated with what those expectations might be for that position. Specifically, you want to highlight the skills and characteristics that successful candidates have for that position, and they'll frequently include that in the job description. And then what you want to prepare is aligning examples of those skills in answers to each question. So for this, and I think I'm gonna, here, there are some best practices for writing your answers. And I want to make sure that all of these come up. So maybe for the next 5 minutes, you're going to take some time, talk with a partner, and work through developing some of this information about your hypothetical position. And for those folks online, is it possible? I don't know if I can send people into breakout rooms or if that's something that others might have to do for me.
Yeah, Casey here is gonna create some for you, Amy. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, hopefully you've had a chance to have a bit of a think about the type of position that you're interested in, some of the skills associated with that position, and how your skills and experiences you might be able to prioritize different experiences that you've had that align really well with those types of positions. And I think we might still be missing some of the breakout room people. I don't know if they've come back yet. Okay.
Cool. Oh, they're 10 seconds.
Sure, that's fine. So maybe what I'll highlight as we're just waiting for those folks to rejoin is this last little bullet point 4 here. And I'm guessing we probably folks didn't have a chance to think this far because this is really specific in crafting your answers to very specific questions. So the next thing we'll talk through are some example questions that are very common throughout the interview process. And as you're thinking about how you will craft your response, you want to consider these 3 main points, including signposts, which means I have experience in 1, 2, 3 things related to XYZ. Or my research experiences have included working in this biome and that biome and the other biome. You're including marked things so that your listeners know exactly that they're counting and they're keeping track of the things that you're using as examples in your answer. Another really common and useful thing to consider is using parallel phrasing. What this means is matching words among different sections of your answers so that things are repetitive and easier to remember on the part of the interviewers. And finally, consistent language. Consider who your audience is and who is on the committee. This is important because even if you're interviewing for an ecosystem science position, but you're using very specific jargon related to that, there may only be one other ecosystem ecologist on the search committee. That person might be nodding along and saying, yes, yes, I understand what you're talking about. But the other people on the committee might not have anything to do with that background. And consequently, you could alienate those people who are listening on the search committee from the get-go. So using consistent language is another thing to be considering when you're preparing your answers. So what are some of the common questions? There are lots, and if you Google search interview questions, you're going to get a whole list of possibilities. These are some of the common ones that I've experienced. This is a really common starting off one. Tell us a little about your interest in this school at the Department of blah, and how you see yourself contributing to the department's mission. This is the part where your background research is going to shine through. You want to highlight specific things that the department has or participates in and why you like this school. And of course, in reality, your answer in your head is, I need a job and you're hiring. Everybody is always thinking this. But what they want is some sort of a more crafted, oh, I really love this aspect about your program and your school, and it's the perfect size. And oh, and by the way, I really want to live in Boulder. And work those in, but you have to work them in carefully. It needs to be about the research there, it needs to be about the specific programs that they offer, and you want to provide specific examples so that they are convinced that you want to come there, when in reality, you're like, it's a school in Kansas, who cares? You don't want them to think that. So very important to plan ahead. Another really common question, usually one of the first few that they'll ask you on these kinds of interviews, provide a broad summary of your research objectives or questions and approaches. How does your research topic relate to the topic of the search? This is already things you've written. This was included in your research statement if this was an academic job. It was included in your selection criteria if you're applying for a federal agency or a nonprofit. So you already have text answering this space. These are one of those places where adding in leading numbers, so you're saying my research topics focus on 1, 2, 3, are a really good way to organize your answer so that the interviewers are just ticking off. Yep, they've got 3 topics, they match, great. And then they can move on. Other really common things. Thinking more broadly about your research program, this might be more of an academic thing, but it also applies in the federal agencies as well. What do you envision your research program will look like? As folks primarily who have or will have a PhD, you'll be conducting independent research in some form or another. Having a sense and being able to describe in very concrete terms what you need to be successful is really important. Do you need a microbalance that costs $50K, or are you going to be okay with having like a general sink and maybe a fume hood and maybe you need a centrifuge? Be very explicit in the kinds of equipment that you might need, especially relative to what the department is already likely to have. If there are institutes or departments or programs that already have some of the materials that you'd need, highlight those in your answer so that you can say, oh, I would build collaborations with these existing places and these existing people so that you're reducing the amount of ask for something like your startup when you're getting your program undergoing. What are your plans for funding? A related question. What funders and programs do you think you would apply to? This is actually true for nonprofits, government agencies, and for academia. As a PhD, you will generally be applying for some form of grant funding, whether it's from private or from other government agencies. So identifying those places where your research fits in the grand scheme of applying for funding and being very explicit in the examples shows that you're prepared and ready to hit the ground running. So have concrete examples to describe. Even better if you have an idea about the title of a first grant that you might be aiming for as a new person starting in this program. If this is more academic leaning and you've got some teaching involved, you want to be able to talk about the classes that you're interested in teaching. Even better if you've checked their course catalog and know what classes already exist that you might take over or contribute to, or new classes that you'd be creating from scratch that complement the existing courses. Depending on how this is phrased, they may also ask you to sort of relate how that connects to your teaching philosophy or teaching experiences. And so this is a great place to bring out, oh, I TA'd for principles of ecology, or I was a TA for 5 semesters for general biology sequence. Talk about how those experiences contributed to and sort of molded your teaching philosophy in a way that relates then to how you'd be teaching at their institution. And then finally, this is a super common one now, although there's controversy depending on which state you're applying to, and that's the idea of focusing on DEIJ initiatives broadly in the sciences and sort of commenting on how you would contribute to those initiatives. Having a well-crafted response that is short but highlights concrete examples of ways that you contribute is the ideal thing here. You can also flip this question later on to ask the department or the people who are interviewing you about what they are already doing, if those kinds of information don't already exist on their website. But if they already have initiatives in place, you should reference those in your answer to show that you've actually taken the time to check and see what's already going on and identified ways that you could support that process. For these common questions, we're going to take another little bit of a pause, pick out 2 questions, and write out bullet points or notes for how you would answer these questions over the next 4 minutes. And this is, you can work with a partner, but also think about things by yourself. Right, we're going to come back all together. Okay, so hopefully that gave you an opportunity to talk through some possible answers to some of the questions. There are many, many more types of questions that are asked. So just to give a few more examples, more questions to think about, especially at schools that involve undergraduate students or undergraduate centric. Think about how you'll involve students, either undergrads or graduate students in your research. This might also be a question around mentoring, more on the teaching interests and how they align with the position, your experience of teaching. And then finally, being able to connect your research program to local resources, either as natural areas, local stakeholders, or some sorts of existing infrastructure that you can tap into should you be able to join the department as part of that position. So there are key differences among the types of schools, if it's school-centric, and certainly different again for government or nonprofit agencies. But there are really different things to emphasize if you're applying for a research-intensive school, a research and teaching school, or a teacher-scholar model where you're primarily supervising undergraduate students only. So how you pitch your answers to these questions should consider the type of a program that you're applying to. Research-intensive schools, you want to go very light on the teaching, and you're focusing on how your research can maybe relate to the teaching, how you involve graduate students, and how you mentor graduate students. Research and teaching, you get to balance things a little bit. And in the teacher-scholar model, you're really talking more about how training undergraduate students in the research process is an innate part of the research program that you're proposing to be running. There are many ways, though, that non-academic jobs will be a little bit different. And so if you are thinking more in that space, especially when we get to questions, we'll be able to expand more here. The next major topic that I want to go over, because this is not something that people naturally think about, is how do you physically set up your space for these remote interviews? And I would just like to say that basically a video-based interview has most of the same considerations as producing a movie or doing live streaming. So the idea is you want to set up your space so that you've got good lighting so that your face looks well, and you don't have distractions happening during your interview. Everyone probably remembers when this happened, right? If you remember, during the pandemic, there was this whole thing about rating people's backgrounds during interviews and giving talks and presentations, right? So make sure your background is work appropriate. Consider the physicality of that space. But then there's how do you actually plant yourself? So you want to position yourself so that you're within the camera frame and that your camera is eye height. When you're giving these interviews and when you're speaking with people, you don't want to be looking at their picture on your screen, because then it looks like I'm not making eye contact. If you look at your camera, that is how you'll be looking people in the eye, which is usually one of the sort of side effect triggers for how people will view your candidacy, is if you're making direct eye contact. Finally, what this means with a typical setup is that you're actually looking down. This is not good. We want to raise things up so that you're looking eye level at your camera. So how do you then set up your actual computer space? This is an example of how I did things. I had an external monitor with my laptop that had the camera on it. So this is just an example, but you should practice this configuration that makes the most sense for you and your setup. So I had a video feed for the interviewers here, my notes with the anticipated questions just on the side, a notepad where I could take notes while I was doing the interview. This might be related to the questions that they were asking me or who was asking those questions, and then a timer. Having that timer running allows you to keep track of how long it is you've been talking. This is really important because they'll often ask you a question and then you have 6 minutes to blabber on with almost no interaction from the people on the other side of the screen. They can't ask you follow-up questions. They might be nodding at you, but that's the only kind of interaction you'll have. It will feel like a very long monologue and it will be awkward. Having that timer running will allow you to sync and be tracking. Oh, I've only been talking for 3 minutes. I know they're asking me 6 questions over 30 minutes, so I've got a couple more minutes to keep talking. Or on the other hand, this is a 20-minute interview and they have 8 questions. I need to time exactly how much time I'm allotting for my answer for each one of these questions, because you do need to get through all 8 of those questions. Having that timer can be very helpful. The important thing, though, is you want to practice what works for you, running through your setup and having your friends or your peers or mentors actually running through using the program and the platform, whether it's Zoom or Skype, could be other types of Microsoft sorts of platform. Make sure you practice it ahead of time so that you know all the updates are installed, everything is fully charged, ready to go, so you won't have those kinds of interruptions ahead of the interview. All right, a couple of preparation tips. There are a whole host. make sure the technology will work. Make sure that you practice talking, again, with having a timer because it will feel weird. Give yourself time before the interview to really get into the interview zone. This means, power pose or however it is that gets you okay with public speaking. Take that time beforehand and then take time again after so that you can actually write down your notes about the questions that they asked, or, oh, I wish I'd thought about this answer. I should have included this other thing. Write that down. And then when you send your thank you notes, include that additional information that you didn't remember to mention during the initial interview. Have a plan that highlights the specific skills and qualifications that are tied back to the job description. Use the exact words. This is especially true for the government stuff. Show up early. This is also one of those intuitive things, but stay conscious of the time. Even by showing up early, by going into the Zoom room, you'll often go into a waiting room that they won't let you in until the time starts. So it's better to make sure that you were able to log in than to be running 5 minutes late because things didn't connect properly. Always better to be there early and then they'll let you in when the time starts. And this is another just reminder, sustain eye contact with your video, with the camera and not the screen. So those are the main tips for doing something remotely. First round interviews are often nowadays conducted either on the phone or more commonly on a video platform. So how are things very different then when you're on site or in person, generally comprising the second round of interviews? So of course, we congratulate and we celebrate because now the whole pool of people is down to 2 to 5 candidates typically. Some important things. There are 3 main types of these second round or on-site or in-person interviews. Type 1, the full academic marathon. We'll step through what that looks like. These are 3 to 4 days typically that include travel. They will schedule with you regarding the flights and the lodging. Often meals will be meetings with many, many different people, and you'll have very regularly scheduled meetings with a whole host of different people, and you'll be giving a talk or talks. The type 2, you'll have a single or a partial day, and that will include maybe the flights and lodging, some meetings and meals, maybe only one talk. Typically, you can also sightsee or you're often on your own more for meals and transit. And I guess I only talked about 2 types here, but so the 2 main types of interviews. For both, make sure that when you're scheduling, you don't compromise your own personal schedule in order to accommodate theirs. This includes things like how quick the turnaround is. You want to give yourself enough time to prep for that interview. You want to make sure those dates are free and available in your personal schedule, and that the flight times don't mean that you're taking red eyes and arriving at some ungodly hour that will make you very uncomfortable for the interview, and that the transportation expectations have been addressed ahead of time. So, what does a full academic marathon look like? This was a typical schedule for one of the interviews that I had. You arrive. Usually someone will meet you to pick you up from the airport, and you may have dinner with that person. The second day then involves a whole host of things, starting from breakfast with meetings with people. Those may be members of the committee. You may give a talk. In this case, I gave a teaching demo first thing in the morning. As you'll notice, the teaching demo started at 8 a.m. This happened to be on the West Coast, so I was coming from the Central Time Zone at this point, so it wasn't quite as early to me, but a 6 a.m. breakfast is very unusually early. Then I had 6 back-to-back meetings with faculty that were 30 minutes each, including meeting with the department chair. Those you all want to prep for and who you're meeting with over the course of the day. And then at some point, there was a lunch, typically with the graduate students. Then it's very often that you give a research seminar after you have lunch. Sometimes they'll flip and you'll do the seminar and then lunch. Then at some point, you're going to meet with the dean or a representative of the dean's office, more faculty meetings, maybe some drinks, and then you go out to dinner. So in this particular example, the day 2 was a 14-hour day without really any breaks. Pack snacks. Day 3, had breakfast with the host, more meetings, maybe some site tours in this particular case, and then the very important search committee wrap-up meeting. We're going to talk more about what that meeting comprises because I think it's actually one of the more important meetings of your trip. Day 4 then would be, in this case, return travel. That's 4 days of you not doing research in real life, not teaching or having your normal experiences. This is just for an interview. And you have to be 100% on this whole time. And this is, you won't have time to go and check your email, to be answering phone calls and engaging with other people or things that are happening. So it's really important that the dates that you've selected for your interview are fully blocked off, and that anyone who needs to contact you knows that you're not available during that time. So let's talk a little bit about who the people are that you're meeting with. You're meeting with a whole range of different people during this type of an interview. That includes the college dean, the department chair, the search committee members, the other faculty in the department, and the graduate students, and maybe sometimes some undergrads. So who are these people and why are you meeting with them? They want to know different things. So the dean, for example, wants to know what unique things you bring. What about the money? How do you fit? The department chair wants to know why here, what support you need to be successful, especially resources and how much startup you need, maybe also about the classes. The search committee wants to know why you. They're the ones who know who all the other candidates are and have read extensively about your background relative to the others. So they want to know what makes you unique. The other faculty in the department, a little different, they want to know how you'll fit. They want to know ways that your research is related to them. Is it complementary? Is it completely different? Or will you be able to work together in the coming future? And then finally, in terms of the graduate students, this will be maybe a little bit more intuitive for those of you still in school, but graduate students want to know what you can do for them. What classes will you teach that they might be able to take? What are your expectations around mentoring and supervising students? And would you be the kind of a mentor they would want to do a graduate degree with? What you will tell them then supplies some of this information, and you can also get information from them. So it's very important to have a list of questions to ask these different individuals. The dean can tell you the long-term patterns at the school or college level, or even more broadly at the university, that you won't get that information from other people. So enrollment patterns and plans. Is this department going to merge with another one? The dean can tell you that. The dean can say, hey, I love the biology department, and they'll tell you why. Those are details you won't get elsewhere. The department chair will tell you often about the retention, tenure, and promotion process, RTP. This is how you would get tenure, how you are promoted to being a full professor, and what those expectations look like. This will vary widely depending on whether this is a research institution or more of a teaching institution. And consequently, you want to know that they have a plan in place for how you'd be evaluated given those different expectations around how you spend your time. This is also where you can ask very explicitly about the breakdown of this position is advertised for 80% research and 20% teaching. That would be a little bit unusual, but if you had that, then they could say, oh yeah, that 20% teaching means you teach one class every year or one class every semester, or however they've decided that 20% is allocated. The search committee members then, they'll tell you about professional development, the research teaching service breakdowns, and how the department fits within the context of the college. Other faculty will talk to you about funding opportunities, professional development, how the teaching load fits with the types of expectations for faculty, and what resources already exist. And then the students will tell you about what it's like to be a student there. This is especially important if you're planning to hire graduate students, and you're going to need to hire students like these students are currently. Is the TA stipend enough? Do they need completely, under the table gigs in order to have this degree? Are they all commuting in from 3 hours away? Getting that context from the students is really important. So preparing for question with these people, how are your questions to these audiences different? And I think actually, given the time, I'm actually going to skip this, but when you have the slides, take a moment to practice writing out these questions. The interview talk is in itself an entire lecture on preparing you for how this process works. So if you want to talk further about how to design a research talk, I'm happy to talk about it, but that's a whole separate thing we could go through. There are many different types of talks that you give during interviews, though. We include the traditional lecture style research talk, somewhere around 30 to 45 minutes, the teaching demonstrations, which could be on a self-selected topic or they may be an assigned topic. And these typically average somewhere between 30 and 60 minutes. Importantly, sometimes you'll have real honest-to-goodness students, Sometimes it'll be fake students where you'll have faculty members pretending to be students and you're just going through the content. And importantly, this is where you're going to demonstrate your teaching philosophy and best practices that you've incorporated in your classes. Finally, there's the chalk talk. This is extremely variable, and you want to get as much clarity from the search committee as you can. The idea here is that you're talking about your research proposed program, and these can range from 30 minutes to 2 hours. They're typically interactive, so you'll be interrupted, and you may have some slides, or you may literally just have a chalkboard. I had a whiteboard for one. It was weird. It's super variable. It's important to know as much as you can about this process ahead of time. So, best practices in hiring, what to expect and what to follow. For those of you who are thinking about the academic track, this is a really interesting paper that I recommend reading. It goes around some of the who becomes an academic faculty member and addresses some sort of uncomfortable questions about the privilege associated with who makes it through all of those hoops from graduate school up to becoming a faculty member. And there are a whole host of explanations for why this happens. So some ideas and papers that I've read and spoken with people on hiring committees, having hiring trainings myself, the remote interview process, when you provide the questions ahead, when there's very limited interaction with the candidates, there's voice only so that you're not seeing the people and therefore judging their appearance in some way. Or if you can even allow pre-recorded answers so that people have multiple takes to be able to come up with an answer that they're happy with. In-person interviews. If they ask you about any accommodations, there were, and I had many interviews in this last iteration. I had 5 on-sites. One of them asked me if I had any meal accommodations. I'm vegetarian. One of them. Now I had to bring it up. And for this particular year, I decided, yep, I'm just going to tell them. But when I was interviewing in past years, I was interviewing in departments where my being a vegetarian might actually be considered not good because it was a rangeland program where part of the people in the department were literally researching how do we make good meat. So if it's advertised that I'm a vegetarian and they're judging that fact, this might actually negatively impact my ability to get this job. This is one of those things that if they're asking you for accommodations and it's going to stay sort of closed within the people who are doing the scheduling, that's the best way to go about it. Providing breaks and ensuring that the committee actually have had trainings on best practices in hiring. And that is especially important when we talk about the things that we would like to change. So to wrap things up super briefly at the end here, things we want to change, but you should know. What to disclose. You do not need to tell people you're married or that you have children, but you will be asked these questions, mostly over dinner, mostly when you're out for drinks, often by students. So you want to know how you will respond given those conditions. For example, I do not wear my wedding ring when I interviewed. Didn't do it. Literally took my ring off because my being married as an academic female meant that it's more likely that I have a partner who is also an academic and would therefore need spousal accommodations, meaning that the university would have to spring for also hiring my partner. As a consequence, it's very common to not wear your wedding bands. Sad, unfortunate truth, but very common. Ordering meals. So, weirdly enough, there are very specific expectations around how you eat out when you're interviewing. Mostly because, especially with the academic marathons, you're eating every meal with someone who is evaluating you and whether you should have this job. What that means is you should have fine dining etiquette, know how to eat with whatever utensils are required for the meal you're eating at. And I say this because I've eaten at restaurants where eating with chopsticks were required or eating with your hands was the expectation for the ethnicity and cuisine that we were eating. So knowing how to eat those diverse cuisines was important, but also being able to handle having allergies or food preferences. I'm a vegetarian, so being able to say that and communicate it in a way that was then accommodated. And how do you handle alcohol? This is another one of these dreadfully awkward situations where you have to say yes to a drink, but you're only really able to do one to show as a woman, I'm not pregnant, I had a drink of alcohol. I'm not even kidding. But more than one shows that, oh, I drink too much and I'm not serious about the position. So there's a very fine, weird line to balance. Sadly unfortunate, but things to be considering. Clothing choices. Be very cognizant of the clothing that you're choosing for these interviews. Some departments are much more formal than others, so if you can get a sense for what their expectations are ahead, it's very useful. And then finally, thank you letters. They have to be sent, but the committee and everyone you email will most likely ghost you and you will never hear from any of them ever again. These include people for whom you have their personal cell phone number. It's very weird. So these are important things to consider that I believe really should be changed, but this is the current state of how things are. Important resources to check just in these last minutes. The EcoEvo Jobs Wiki is a really good resource that posts both academic, government, nonprofit types of permanent positions are posted here, along with deadlines and links to where those positions are being advertised. So that's super useful. And I think that sort of brings us to my main summary at the end, is that allowing yourself to celebrate through every step of the way. So that went over just a tad, and I apologize for that, but I'm happy to take any questions or to talk further with folks for the next bit.
Thanks, Amy. Any questions for Amy? That was fantastic.
Yeah.
One, two. Let's throw in the chat. I'll start with one. Amy, what if you don't want to drink alcohol at all during dinner?
Then you may want to disclose it to the search committee ahead of time.
Okay.
There are very good cultural reasons, for example, why people don't drink. There are very important health reasons. There are all sorts of reasons why people don't drink. You could just not and decide that if they really care honestly that much, you don't want to work there. For you, this may be a red flag that's a do or die. If they care, then I don't want them situation. But you should be aware that you will be judged. The fact that they are judging you is a very bad thing, but they will judge you. And this is much worse if you're a woman. For guys, you can probably get away without drinking, and people will just they may not notice as much and they may not be paying as much attention, sadly. This is one of those gendered things.
Interesting. Unfortunate, but interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. And I should say the wedding ring situation is similar. Men who wear a wedding ring are viewed as being stable and more likely to stick around. They're less of a flight risk. Women with a wedding ring indicate that their spouse is more likely to be in academia and therefore require accommodations for the two-bodied problem, and therefore are less likely to be considered. And there are actual papers and manuscripts and studies that have shown that this is when it is known that a candidate who's a woman who's married, it very strongly negatively impacts the hiring selection process.
Wow. Unfortunate.
And these are not even papers that you would expect from the 90s. These are from 2003. Sorry, 2003, or 2023. I can't talk. Like this year, last year. Like super recent papers that are come out. Yeah.
Right. Interesting.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that oftentimes in the meals and other things, you'll get personal questions about whether you have kids or not. Any advice for how to navigate that gracefully?
Oh, it's so hard. I'll often say, oh, I have a really close friend whose kids da 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 da. My husband handled these questions by saying, oh, my best friend does these things, so that's why I know more about this. His best friend was me. He was talking about me, but he couldn't call me his wife. Right?
Fair enough.
So I will talk about my niece and nephews. Now, I don't personally have kids, so I wasn't deflecting the reality of my having children when I didn't. So I would talk about friends, I would talk about my niece and nephews and deflect in that way. But being creative can be important. Now, there are some cases where my deflection probably hurt me because they were looking for someone who would fit the rest of the department who had children. There were entire meetings that, in retrospect, when I was looking at what the topic of conversation was, I was like, oh, this meeting, the goal was to tell me about how good it is to have kids here. That was why they had me meet with that person. And of course, that whole time I was trying to not talk about having children or not having children because I was trying to avoid those topics. But that probably came across as very hedgy and probably a little sketchy to them. And so, I mean, I don't know that's why I didn't get the job, but we can assume it may have contributed, right? So you never quite know. This could go in both directions. I don't think I'm quite catching what this person's saying.
Oh, there's one in the chat. We're looking at the chat.
At the chat. That's a great question. So the question in the chat is, I have colleagues who've been contacted by federal agencies and industry who have been invited using these words and sort of afterward or noticed that they were not selected as a candidate, even though they thought they were, and they're not aware that they were being interviewed. So it actually also happens in academia for a few reasons. One of which, none of them good. None of these are good practices. Many times job advertisements have a quota, a number of people that they need to have applied for the search to be considered successful. They can further break down information from the HR side about the type of people who applied. And the type of people in this case being related to their metric benchmarks around male-female breakdown or background ethnicities or something like this. And they will encourage people to apply for positions to increase those HR metrics. This is abysmal, should probably be illegal if it's not, but this is one thing that does happen. The interview, how they evaluate candidates, what's going on in the back door. And I haven't obviously served yet on a faculty search committee, but I've helped hire many different types of people over time and taken a lot of training in how do we hire people correctly. And it's somewhat appalling how little consistency there is on the backside of what the interviewing process is comprised of. And so it's going to be super variable by school, by department within a school, and even between hiring communities in the same department or in the same program. So reaching out to people to get them to apply, super common to increase numbers. It isn't really connected to how well they think that person fits for the position always.
Thanks, Amy. All right, well, we are at noon, but let's give one more time. That was super informative. Thank you so much. And you said you're going to send the slides that we can share, and this recording will be on our blog post as well. Okay, great. Thanks, Amy.
Yep.
Thank you.
Bye.